guest lecturers, Dr. Horst Simon. Dr. Simon is the Deputy Director of the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Before that, he was, in a nutshell, responsible for everything computing within the laboratory, wearing 3 hats: Associate Lab Director for Computing, the Director of the Computational Research Division, and I think at some point also the Director of NERSC, all at the same time. He has been known for a lot of advances, some of which we actually saw in this class. The spectral partitioning algorithm we've seen in graph partitioning class was due to himself, Alex Poton, and others. And today he's going to be talking about supercomputers and superintelligence. I had the pleasure to watch an earlier version of this talk at the SIAM Parallel Processing 2 years ago in Paris as a keynote speech, and we'll see how the technology has fared since then.
Okay, thank you. Great pleasure to be here. I also used to teach this class the same way Aiden is co-teaching it 10 years ago. I'll comment on this in a little while. So this is a talk that's about, in various iterations, more than 2 years old, and I was motivated by the Ex Machina movie and a lot of excitement about full, strong AI expectations, and I said, best way to really make sense with supercomputers and AI, how do the two get together? So this is the last week of the semester class, so it's mostly entertainment, but I'm putting a number of pointers in various different directions on what might be interesting. So 2 years ago, one of the big excitements also was that AlphaGo of DeepMind, that's now acquired by Google, was winning Go the first time against the human grandmaster, Lee Sedol. That was in March 2016. And of course, this technology has moved very quickly onward. Last October, the same group posted this paper in Nature, which was actually even more exciting, more intriguing, because it was not just learning the Go game from playing against human players, but it was just learning Go from the basic rules by playing against itself. So Go was for many years seen as one of those challenges that a computer could not possibly meet, and then suddenly computers basically seem to learn the game from its own. So this is seen as a background to a lot of discussion in the last 2 years of superintelligence. So the notion of superintelligence is that computers and together with AI, machine learning, and technology changes, that is growth in computing power, are on a very rapid growth towards something that is super intelligent, that is, they're more powerful, thinking more and better than humans, and go fast beyond humans. And then you have various famous people who are very concerned about this phenomena, who are concerned that if computers get more powerful than humans, all bad things might happen. So you can read all this. It might be the success in creating AI would be the biggest event in human history. It might be also the last one. So there's this notion indirectly that computers, once they get very powerful, they will take over humanity, kill us all, and the world will be different as we go into the future. And what strikes me as an oddity here is, and these are big, very well-known people and deep thinkers, is with the exception of Bill Joy, none of them is a computer scientist. So, and Bill Joy also for 15 years has been speculating about doom and gloom anyway, so that maybe in his mind that everything is going to get just worse. So I think they're all pessimists, or in terms of, I want to talk a little bit more about superintelligence and put this in the framework of this class, because this class is about high-performance computing. So let's talk about supercomputers, and that's of course trivial for you. At any given time, these are the most powerful systems that are out there for scientific and engineering problems. It's always important to put this in parentheses, because they are larger computing systems that might be more powerful, but they're not used for scientific and engineering problems. And up to very recently, supercomputing and AI were really in two different worlds. There's not much discussion, conversation between these two computing fields, which is very unfortunate. So just very briefly, and this was what you've learned about in this class quite a bit, is that supercomputing, HPC, traditional HPC, is on the way towards exascale. There's a lot of excitement about exascale. There are national initiatives around the world. In the US, there's this exascale computing project that a lot of us at the lab, and maybe some of you are here, involved in. There are similar initiatives like this in China, in Japan, in Europe. This is where the HPC world is currently going. It's the big thing. So what I want to talk about in this presentation is first talk about current trends in supercomputing, this path to exascale where HPC is going. Then talk about computing on the brain. That's actually a very complex set of things. There are a couple of themes that I want to elaborate, and then sort of talk about what computers still can't do, which is the third piece of my presentation. So I'm participating in this top 500 group. There's a lot of debate about top 500. This is listing the world's most powerful supercomputers based on one simple benchmark that, of course, all of you should know, which is the high-performance Lindbergh benchmark solving dense linear systems. You probably have discussed this. There's a lot of controversy whether that benchmark is really a good benchmark for supercomputers. It is not really a good benchmark for supercomputers, but you have to think of it as the hello world of supercomputing, if you want to put it this way. A system that cannot solve dense linear systems of equations is not useful at all for anything. So it sort of discriminates vaporware and underdevelopment systems from actually something that's really out there. So the other important thing about this list is, and this is my good friend Hans Moyer, who unfortunately passed away a couple of years, and who had the original ideas. The important thing is this has been going on since the early 90s, and there's a lot of work that has gone into it, and it sort of gives you a long database of systems as they have developed over the last 25 years. So we're celebrating 25 years of this list now. So this is what the list looks like as of today. These are the top systems on the list, the most powerful supercomputers. You may have heard about this in this class already. Just pointing out that, and that's why I cut it up with number 8, this is Berkeley. I hope, who has used Cori in the class as for homework assignments? 1, 2. What did the others do? Did you use whatever your...
everyone used Cori, but Haswell partition.
Ah, I see. Anyway, Cori has been, is on this list, and there are many other systems. The number 1, number 2 systems are systems in China, which in itself is interesting. That's one of the dynamics of the list. It's interesting because those Chinese systems are, the number 1 is completely built from domestic parts. So this is, in other ways, a way of how the list is useful because it gives you a sense of progress that different technologies make, different countries make. Number 2 system is also in China. This one has part of Intel Xeon processors, and so that has still a number of, if you want to call it, American parts. I'd like to tell you a little anecdote. I was in China in 2003 or 2004 and was invited speaker for a symposium. And there was an IBM system that was dedicated, and that was actually at that time among the top 10 of the list. And I asked, there was an IBM and an Intel representative there, and I said, how did you get over the export control regulations and get a supercomputer of this size into China? And they said, oh, we didn't export anything. The IBM system, the chassis, everything was built in Taiwan, and Intel shipped the processors from Malaysia. Nothing ever touched American soil. So the whole system of, the whole notion of what type of country is the system from is becoming actually irrelevant except for people who like to control export because they think it's a good idea to manage foreign relations. Okay. Anyway, that's just a little bit side conversation. These are 2 software computers in Berkeley. As I said, Cori is number 8 on the list and Edison's further down. Edison's being replaced by NERSC 9. That's going to be an exciting new system coming in a couple of years. So what the top 500 list does, and you may have seen this already, is going back, as I said, until 1993, 25 years. It lists the number 1 system on the list, and you see the green line is the number 500 list system on the list, and the sum, and you see incredibly over this 25 years, this real almost straight line on a log chart, which means there was exponential growth in high performance computing. Now that list has led many people to simply say, oh, that's going to continue forever, and draw a straight line extrapolation. If you believe a straight line extrapolation, you see that the number one system will be a exaflop system in 2020, which I actually have a bet that that's not going to happen, and I'm going to win the bet because there will be no exaflop system with Lindbergh in 2020. I'm absolutely convinced about this. But it also sort of ignores some other things. This is just past 25 years. Just as an aside, it's a real bad idea to do exponential growth and then do extrapolation on exponential growth, because if you're off a little bit, it actually means you're off in real life by a lot. So this is some of the extrapolations that have been made, but the interesting thing is, since about 2008, that curve is no longer growing. Actually, the number 500 curve is going on a different slope, so the growth rate is no longer what it was. And if you go into 2013, you see from 2013 on, the total list is no longer growing as much as it used to grow. And that means the growth of high-performance computing really has slowed down for the last 5 years. So now you can see why. There are many explanations, but the important thing is that once the growth has been slowing down, we have different growth curves. These extrapolations just don't make sense at all. So if you think that the growth curves have slowed, it doesn't make sense at all to expect an exaflop system by 2020 if on the new growth curve, all systems together are almost just an exaflop. So here's a way how the top 500 list can be really useful. And this is looking at the annual performance increase from year to year of the top 500 list over the last 25 years, over the past year. So take all 500 systems and look at the factor their performance has been increasing. So you see that the top 500 average was at about 1.8, 1.9 1 year over the next. Moore's law over 1 year, so Moore's law doubles every 18 months, say if that's what you expect. Moore's law gets you per year 1.6, so that's here. And now you see that since about 2012, 2013, the performance increase in the top 500 list was even below Moore's law. Things are slowing down. Things have been slowing down. Now here's my little quiz question to get your attention. How is it that the top 500 have been consistently outperforming Moore's law? How can that be? Come on, that's why you're here in class. Why you're here in class? Parallelism, yes, parallelism. So over that period, not only did Moore's law improve the performance of the individual processes, but the systems have become more and more parallel. So you got actually up to here an aggregate effect of about 1.8, 1.9 per year, which is much more than Moore's law, because of the increased parallelism in the systems. And so the interesting thing is that for about 4 or 5 years, you're not falling only behind Moore's law, but apparently parallelism doesn't help you anymore to push up the performance of those systems. So I'll make a not so bold claim. It may have been a bold claim a couple of years ago, but basically Moore's law is going to end. Moore's law is really more an economic law. That is, it has always been pushed by the semiconductor industry, and the semiconductor industry lived off Moore's law, that things got always better and faster and faster. But in principle, no matter how you think about it, Moore's law has to end, because the actual scaling, semiconductor scaling now has reached sort of scaling limits, which means that once you get to a point when gates are so small that you actually have not enough atoms to build a gate anymore, Moore's law has to end. And so that's pretty much where we're at. If you work for Intel, you cannot say anything about Moore's law ending, because that would really upset the investors, because the investors think of Gordon Moore and Intel living off it. So I know that for sure. There was a panel discussion last year that our colleague John Shelf tried to organize, and he had an Intel person. The title of the panel discussion was The End of Moore's Law. He had an Intel representative invited to join, and then the Intel guy couldn't come, because nobody in Intel can participate in a discussion of the end of Moore's law. It's not going to end. So anyway, so Moore's law will end presumably, and so we're seeing already a slowdown, because Moore's law will not fall off a cliff. It's generally slowing down. So high performance computing has been slowing down, and it's reaching a point where we have to really look at some replacement technology. There's a big effort out there to actually start thinking about what would be successor technologies for CMOS semiconductors that could be used in future supercomputers. So keep that in mind. I'll use that as a very important fact later on for some of the discussion. So now I want to talk about computing in the brain. And this is a bit complex, and I realized that there are several different interactions when you talk about computing in the brain. And this is sort of a map on where I'm going to go in the big bulk of the next of the talk. So we're actually talking about three different things: the brain, high-performance computing, and AI and machine learning. And there are several different interactions. So for example, how does this brain inspire new computer architecture? In one direction between HPC and the brain. And by brain, I mean not just the brain, but neuroscience, say. The other way around, how is HPC used today in neuroscience? Different direction here. Then you can see the same interaction here. Is the brain really a model for AI and machine learning? Vice versa, how is AI and machine learning used in neuroscience? And then you can look at the interaction between AI and machine learning and HPC today, how they influence each other. How does AI and machine learning be getting implemented on HPC, using HPC, and vice versa? What does HPC do for AI and machine learning? Now, you may have seen this, but I just want to put this very simple chart up there to make it very clear. When I say about machine learning, then I mean deep learning and a number of other algorithms. I know you had our lecture 8 and actually presented this on some supervised and unsupervised learning. So you know that deep learning is responsible for the current boom, but only one of the many tools in the toolbox of machine learning. Machine learning is a subset of AI, so AI is many other things, including you have here robotics, vision, speech synthesis, and other things that are, and building mechanical instruments. So there is a lot of other things in AI outside of machine learning. But that's kind of the picture to keep in mind. So let me first a little bit historically talk about HPC usage in AI, and this is AI in the general sense where AI was coined since the 60s and then the 80s. And so the top 500 performance predictions as you go in the future are these straight lines, which I just argued are wrong. And the reason I want you to say that these are wrong is because if you look in sort of populist AI literature, you see these charts, and these are the charts which really irritate me a lot. This is way back from Kurzweil's Age of Spiritual Machines, but you can see it also repeated in Bostrom's book, and they really say, well, computing seems to be just growing by itself, by its own dynamics forever. Kurzweil actually makes the point that the computing power has been growing more than exponentially over many technology areas, from basically tabulators through transistors to integrated circuits, and in between vacuum tubes. So there are at least 4 generations in there. And so it's postulated that this growth will continue. It's actually a self-reinforcing growth, and so we don't have to worry about it. Well, I am worrying about it because, as I said, the end of Moore's law is close. So we're somewhere up here at 2020, and I do not see the successor technology that will get us beyond Moore's law. So the second sort of consequence of these charts is that somehow there is an equation of the intelligence of insect, mouse, human, all humans that is equated with the growth of compute power. And if you look at the lines again from Kurzweil's book, is you see that by about 2000 computers have reached the intelligence of an insect and so on, and we're now somewhere between 20 and 25. You'll see that computers will reach the power of a human brain. To some extent, that's actually true, because I'll say in a few slides that an exaflop computer will probably have equivalent power to a computational brain, but that doesn't mean that you will have all the cognition of a human in a supercomputer. But that's what I think is a very simplistic. Here's another chart which shows the simplistic growth curves. So I think my main point here is these growth curves always suppose that there is unlimited computing power growth in the future. I think we have seen an exceptional time from the 60s onward that computing power followed an exponential growth, but there's no reason to assume that this will continue forever. As a matter of fact, we're at a point where we really have to revisit if that growth is even possible at all in the future. Consequently, if you just believe that you wait for computers to become more powerful and then you will have human-level intelligence, that's sort of, I think, false hope. So what I'm saying here is really that a lot of early AI researchers basically did very naive performance extrapolation of current performance and did not take into consideration post-Moore's law. And of course, they also assumed that these systems that are built there are useful for cognitive computing, but they are not, because they're mostly built for scientific simulations. They excel in scientific computing. They're not excelling in anything that's related to cognitive computing. So they also assume scaling of AI, machine learning to millions, of course. I think we're making good progress in learning this. But in summary, and this is, I think, the most important point here is that all the progress that you've seen in the last 5 years in machine learning was mostly accomplished through algorithmic improvements, not that much through machine power. Of course, now that we have made some significant algorithmic accomplishments, then machine power is helping solving larger and more important problems. But algorithmic changes have brought machine learning to the level of today. So going back in history, there are a couple of important data points. So who knows here, who has ever heard about thinking machines and the connection machine? It's always my standard trivia question, of course, old timers. So I used to use this image in student welcome to Berkeley lab talks in the 1990s and later on. And I remember that it was in 2001 or 2002, I asked who had heard about thinking machines, and these were all sort of summer students. Then I had the first time a room where only one finger went up, about 25 or 30. So this tells you, this is a wonderful technology in the early 90s. So you could think of thinking machines in 1990 being like, if you want to say it, Google today, that everybody was saying, oh, great and wonderful, and what a fantastic, and it was a great company, but there's a long history about this. But anyway, the interesting point about this machine, the CM2, was that it was originally built for AI applications, and then later on, basically re-engineered, if you want to say it this way, or redesigned for scientific computing. There was actually a version that simply added floating point capability to the internet connection network that the thinking machines provided. That was the CM5. So it evolved from an AI machine using Lisp, star Lisp, a parallel version of Lisp, to a scientific computing machine. And so what is intriguing was that at that point in time, the late 80s and early 90s, actually AI and parallel computing were very tightly interwoven. And there were not just thinking machines, but there was another company called BBN, which built the BBN Butterfly, which had a similar history of starting in the AI world. This was, of course, the AI boom of the late 80s that influenced high-performance computing significantly. But, and I think that's another thing which is important, federal funding in the early 90s was focusing very strongly about high-performance computing and no longer about AI. AI did not live up to the promise of its days, and you heard about all this. I'll tell you another anecdote, because in the end you only remember the anecdote. So I was working at Boeing at the time, and so in Boeing we moved to this wonderful, great new building, and there was a group I was with that was the scientific computing group. There was also the AI group. And we moved into this new building, and our AI colleagues, of course, were very ambitious. So they had this big sign, artificial intelligence, one floor up, and they had an arrow going up the stairs. So then somebody from our group put a poster underneath and said, real intelligence, this floor. So I know this sounds odd, but this was how the scientific computing guys thought about AI in the late 80s. A lot of hype and nothing delivered, which in some sense turned turned out to be exactly the right
So
attitude.
if this current AI boom also disappears in the next couple of years, should we expect big scientific computing computers from companies like Cerebras or GraphCore, just like thinking machines?
Yeah, that's a I'm coming to that. I'll answer that later. Yes, I think so. I actually think so. So anyway, so the AI boom of the early years had influenced parallel computing early on, but then faded away for various different reasons. So you can read about this of the history of AI. So nothing much happened for about 10 years or so, and then IBM did actually a wonderful thing. They built this Deep Blue chess computer, which was built in 1997. Garry Kasparov, who was the world champion in chess, was challenged. He played against this machine and lost. And so this was a huge success because it was the first time that a machine intelligence was beating a human chess player, Garry Kasparov. As great and wonderful as IBM was in this, there was a lot of things that you can, in hindsight, complain about it. So one complaint I'd say is they should have put the machine and the software in the Smithsonian, but they didn't make the software available to anybody. So there's no further analysis how this actually was turning out to be a very successful system. Furthermore, I had sort of the fortune of meeting Garry Kasparov at a conference, computing conference, where he was the invited speaker. Ironically, IBM actually invited him to speak, and he had nothing but bad things to say about IBM from the chess player's point of view, which is, of course, when you get a sort of, he's not Russian, he's Armenian, but if you get a sort of elite Soviet scientist, he will only talk negatively about an American computer company. You can figure that out. But he had a very, very important point. And the very important point that he made is that chess players, human chess players, learn how to play the game by studying their opponent. They're looking at many games their opponents are playing, and then they get from that study a certain holistic impression how their opponent behaves in certain situations. He said what IBM did was they changed the software every time they played a new game. So he had no way of studying Deep Blue as an opponent. He could not understand how the system actually works, thinks, if you want to use that term. So I think that's a very important point. And unfortunately, we cannot reproduce any of this because, as I said, the software is gone. A little while later, IBM again did a very strong showing of machine intelligence, created Watson. Watson had, as you know, another one of those very public successes of beating in Jeopardy the top contestants. Actually, down here you see Shankar Sastry and myself trying to compete with Watson, but we did this here in Sudhaksha Dai Hall, but that was more just a fun event. It was one of the IBM PR events they put on to launch the Watson everywhere. Important thing was Watson actually uses the IBM Power, I think it was the Power 7 originally, system, so it was a supercomputing architecture that was used. The system, of course, is still a commercial system that IBM is selling. It's actually very successful commercially in this, more as a software platform than, and the important thing is that they're selling this. But I think it's the same thing I can say here. What I said about Deep Blue is there's very little known in science about how Watson actually works and what the background is. And so all we know is it runs on a parallel platform, but don't know how well it runs. So this was 6-7 years ago. So where are we today? I would say today we are actually now HPC and machine learning are quite happy together. That's a good thing. That happened because of the revolution in machine learning and the deep learning activities that you've heard about it. And the reason is because a lot of the computational kernels or motifs in machine learning have been already deeply investigated in the HPC world. And so there's a real connection between graph analytics, image processing, and linear algebra that are all important for implementing machine learning algorithms effectively on HPC platforms, where knowledge that was taught in this class for many years, and where practitioners who have been involved in linear algebra and graph analytics, like Aiden, for example, you've heard some of those things in this class, how all this knowledge can be leveraged into the HPC world. So our group up at the lab has done an analysis and looked at a number of machine learning techniques and how they map on different scientific applications. And you can actually see that a lot of the machine learning applications are directly applicable to science, and my colleague there, Prabhat, has done a wonderful thing of putting together a whole portfolio of these ideas. Just want to show one, how machine learning is helping, for example, today in climate science. So this is, in climate science, you get these pictures which show you precipitation, a pattern. You try to automatically detect rare events like hurricanes or atmospheric rivers in those events, and you do this automatically because you really have terabytes of data and you don't want to go individually through this, so you're using classification, segmentation to find these events in here. Basically, the same algorithms that find you cats on the internet will find you hurricanes and atmospheric rivers. And the interesting thing is, and I just want to point this out so there's much more to be said about it, is that this runs at NERSC on Cori at about 15 petaflops. So it runs as an HPC application using scientific data sets. So I think what we've seen in the last 5 years is that machine learning has actually impacted science very strongly and is using HPC very successfully at HPC rates. And so I think that is one important change, that now we are at a point where actually machine learning, at least, and HPC are much more closely tied together than they have been historically for more than 30 years. So next topic I want to talk about is, how does the brain inspire a new computer architecture? And I think that is another important aspect here. So if you look at today's supercomputer as it's built, say for example at Cori up at NERSC, you can look at the number of transistors, memory, clock rate, power, etc., weight, and compare it to the human brain. And if you compare it to the human brain, you see that actually the number of transistors is larger than the number of neurons. The memory, if you assume that in the synaptic connections, that's where the brain stores memory, supercomputers are sort of in the same range of having the power that you have in synaptic connections. Of course, you see that the brain really works in the milliseconds clock rate, so you basically refresh every 20 milliseconds. And the brain only requires 20 watts of power, whereas you see that supercomputers require megawatts to very soon tens of megawatts of power and run, of course, at a very high clock rate. And of course, you know, in terms of size and weight, no comparison at all. So I've worked in the past with Dharmendra Modra's group at IBM Almaden, and we've done some simulations of the brain on supercomputers. And I'll just bring this up for two reasons. One is, these brain simulations have been, and I admit this, very controversial in the neuroscience community, because they were really just taking an artificial connectivity, which reflected statistically the connectivity of the brain, and we're exploring how you can actually solve ODEs, neural spikes, on this interconnected network, and doing this in terms of rates and size and number of neurons and connectivity for different organisms. So the reason I say this was because this was run on this on the Blue Gene machine. So I'm stopping here at the cat. This was done on two systems, IBM Watson, that was the Watson Blue Gene system in Watson, IBM Yorktown Heights, and another system, Shaheen, which actually is in Saudi Arabia. The reason it was in Saudi Arabia because nobody in the US wanted to give us computer time. I had applied to DOE and my application got rejected. So believe this, in case you get rejected for supercomputing time by DOE, I didn't get any supercomputing time on the Argonne Blue Gene system. So, but the Saudis were very generous in giving us free time on their system. Always important to point out these little side stories. Anyway, the other story here is when the cat size simulation was run, and just to make sure that you understand, this was a large system of ordinary differential equations which had of the order of cat neurons 10 to the 6 equations with an interconnection between the system that had reflected the presumed synaptic interconnection of cat neurons. This paper was actually selected for the Gordon Bell Prize, and it created a huge stir in the neuroscience community because the neuroscience community attacked this as a complete wrong simulation. Well, if you're a neuroscientist who's trying to understand the brain, it was a wrong calculation, but that was not what this was about. This was just trying to understand scaling of these type of synaptic networks on high-end systems. Anyway, it was continued. There were two, but the important thing of this was that we did in this 2012 paper, in this 2009 paper, some extrapolation. And the extrapolation was just saying, if we do this, how big a computer do we need to have if we would really understand the brain? So that is, if we would have a map of the brain, if you would have a whole set of how many neurons there are exactly and how they're connected, how big a computer would we have to build? And so it's very simply based on the extrapolation. If you wanted to have the real time, that is the 20 millisecond update at human scale, real time, our extrapolation was we need more than 1 exaflop and we need 4 petabytes of memory. So that was an interesting figure because this was done in 2012. So we said there is another interesting case that you need an exaflop computer to at least to first order of magnitude simulate the brain. I was very intrigued just last year to find a paper by I forgot, Tarasinowski at UC San Diego and the Salk Institute, who actually did a thorough analysis of the connectivity and the synaptic strength, and he found a very interesting new result that wasn't really appreciated, and this was that he found out by doing basically neuroscience that there are 26 different sizes of synapses, and so this means each synapses has 4.7 bits if you just do simple information theory, and then you multiply by, we know what the number of synapses are in the brain, which is always, I have this 10 to the 12, I think. So you see that each synapse, so basically the brain, by just looking at synaptic strength, can store about 4 to 5 petabytes of memory. So this is biological approach which comes to exactly the same number, 4 to 5 petabytes of storage capability of the brain. Now, the reason I say all this is because what we have is that today we think that you could do a full brain simulation on an exaflop computer with 4 to 5 petabytes of memory. So that's a buildable system. This would be the type of system we'll probably see by about 22 or 23. And it's interesting that 3 different paths came to about the same estimate. The first one, brute force direct comparison, then the one with a simulation, then the one that came motivated by biological investigation. But the important message here is that a supercomputer, an exaflop supercomputer, will use 20 to 30 megawatts of power. That's almost a constraint that is built on those supercomputers, because with 20 to 30 megawatt per power, this is about 20 to 30 million a year of actual power bill that needs to be paid. The human brain only takes 20 watt. So let that sink in. So if we build a supercomputer, exaflop supercomputer that can simulate about what the human brain could do, just potentiality, we would have to build a system that is, there's basically a factor of 1 million in terms of the brain power versus the supercomputer, because we still would have something that only is a million, we will build something that's 1 million times more energy consuming than what the brain is consuming. So keep that fact in mind, and I'm going to go on a little detour on computer architecture, which is very important, which is again ties into what this class is all about. So we talked about all this already. So the way I want to say is, why are we here today? This is a class about applications and how applications and algorithms and computer architecture interact. This is an old picture, 1952, von Neumann and Robert Oppenheimer. So it's 2 key figures that are in this one photo together. Von Neumann, of course, because he was a pioneer in computing. He built some of the first digital computers. And of course, he had the von Neumann architecture, which was really a breakthrough and an architectural accomplishment to think about stored program computers. And the important thing is to see von Neumann and Oppenheimer together because, and this is something which, of course, one liked to forget very quickly, was all the early computing development was motivated by weapons, by weapons research, and in particular by nuclear weapons. And Oppenheimer is, of course, known as one of the fathers of the nuclear weapons, of the atomic bomb at Los Alamos National Lab. So the early computers were built for nuclear weapons and for doing computational physics simulations, floating point intensive simulations. Now here we are, 60, 70 years later, in 2015, 2018, and we're still using the Neumann architecture. So I put this here basically from the mushroom cloud to the computer cloud. We're using the same architecture, the same scheme that von Neumann had developed for floating point intense 2-3D grid-based numerical calculations in computational physics. We're using that same architecture for everything we use in computers today, from networking, web searches, social networking, I should have said, music, photography, whatever else you use your intelligent device in your pocket for. So that's kind of odd that the same architecture has been useful for such a long time. The reason this architecture has been useful for such a long time is Moore's law, because the performance of the computers always increased significantly, so you didn't really have to think hard about architecture. Today we're at a time when Moore's law is going to end, and because Moore's law is going to end, we have to think much harder about computer architecture. So all of you in CS, I hope you've taken already your computer architecture class. But coming back to the brain, this is from my colleagues at IBM Almaden, they basically point out that in the past, writing Moore's law, we have increased clock frequency and power density. We built more powerful, more denser, more power-consuming chips. But if you really look where the brain is, it's totally in the opposite direction. It's much low power. It's not running at a high clock rate. It's running only, as I said, at a 20 millisecond cycle time. So computer architecture has gone in a direction where we're up here, where we hit a barrier, Moore's law barrier. We need to go in the opposite direction if we really want to accomplish something in terms of brain-like computing. So this is the premise that is behind what's called neuromorphic computing. And this is really to look at computer architecture from the perspective of how can we leverage some ideas that are coming out of the brain in terms of interconnection networks, basically don't have large memories, have just sort of, in a sense, small local memories, build very powerful networks. There are a number of those projects listed here. They're all, in a sense, motivated by this. This is the one project that I mentioned before, the IBM Synapse project, which was the outcome of those many years of simulation work that IBM did and that I was partially involved with, which is a very remarkable system. And the important thing is that it's built with conventional CMOS technology. It's I think it's not even listed here. I think it's a 26 nanometer Samsung actually produced chip. So we've done some exploration of the system. It's not really clear how useful it is, but it's out there. I mean, have you been involved in some of the True North? No. Anybody here involved in True North evaluations? I mean, you can comment on this. We've gotten some results out of it, but now I want to switch to a completely different story which fits right in here. And I would like you to meet Amir Khosrowshahi, who took this class in 2008. He was actually a PhD student in the Redwood, in the Willis Redwood Neuroscience Institute, but he took this class here, and basically he built this we might call neuromorphic system called Nirvana for multiple years, and his company got acquired by Intel about a year and a half ago for $400 million. So don't think that CS267 does not lend itself to commercialization. And I asked him, he sent me an email and said, I want to talk about this in the class to motivate all of you. And he basically said, the first homework assignment, writing the fast matrix multiply first gem, they had done on NVIDIA hardware of the time. They did it faster than CUDA. That was homework 1. and so on. You can read all this. It will be in the lecture notes. He basically gives CS267 a lot of credit, and he said you can make a commercial, and so if you want to work for Intel for him, please send him email. It's somewhere listed here. he still looks at the CS267 as his training and proving ground for what Intel is now doing. There's quite a bit more stuff on what he has learned in the class, which I'll skip over. So basically, we've seen that the brain today, because of the slowdown in computer in the Moore's law, and the fact that computer architecture has not been investigated, is leading to a, I would say, change in computer architecture, possibly as we move to the future. And now I want to say this, that AI and machine learning really disrupt HPC, and you've seen all these things here, that there's just a huge momentum in machine learning out there. Companies use it all over. I got an invitation, do you want to be a machine learning scientist at Bed Bath & Beyond? And so I said, gee. One recruiter reaching out to me, and I said, okay, is that where my future will lead me, to Bed Bath & Beyond? And I said, probably not, but it gives you a sense on where this is going. It's going full force everywhere. So it had already considerable impact on the exascale project. The Argonne A21 exascale computer is actually motivated by machine learning, and they say that machine learning data will be as much a driver for that exascale architecture as the traditional simulation. So as you see, support for 3 pillars, and so this is a 21-22 plant machine. So that's one indication how machine learning, in this case, they are using, actually I don't think they have announced what they're using, but they're using some more machine learning type processing. But what's actually more important is that I think today, I could say AI and cryptocurrencies are eating the lunch of high-performance computing. And what I mean by that is very simply is that the sudden increase in cryptocurrency mining, as you probably are all aware, has pushed up the prices that NVIDIA and others, also most recently AMD, can charge for their boards. So you pay twice as much today as you paid for the same board than you paid for a year ago. A year ago, I think last fall, it was even hard to find any boards. Now I think supply is coming, but prices are still high. What that did was, interestingly, and this hasn't really sunk into, this has led to a price increase everywhere in computing. So even if you use NVIDIA or don't use NVIDIA, everything has gotten more expensive because everybody figured out we can charge a premium as long as people buying additional boards for their Ethereum or Bitcoin or whatever mining, as long as the market holds, the companies will charge those prices. Well, HPC platforms that using graphics processors will then also double in cost. And as I said, there is a trend that all the HPC platforms will use graphics processors as we go in the future. Now, the interesting thing in a market society is, of course, that there's always an immediate reaction. And the reaction is that there is VC interest in chip startups. I have not seen VC interest in chip startups of that type since the mid-90s. It's just totally amazing. So you can walk into companies, and some of us have been to see a company like Cerebras in Los Altos, and they got 100 million plus VC money for building a computer chip manufacturer. That's pretty amazing, because for 15, 20 years, nobody was investing in this technology. The reason why that is because there's all this AI and machine learning stuff happening in the background, and NVIDIA is sitting on a pile of cash and is making money like robbers, and so this is where the money is, and therefore the VCs go there. So there are about 45 startups that work on chips that can sort of address tasks like speech or self-driving cars, or anything that falls into the general AI category. Some of them are using architectures that are motivated by brain-like neuromorphic architectures. There's many different architecture approaches. All this, just to make sure that I say this for the record, all this, there's an article, I think either in the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, which describes all this, so it's all public information. So actually, Google with the TPU, for example, is in the same space. They decided to build their own processing unit because they didn't want to be dependent on the market. So basically what that means is that machine learning is creating something like a PC revolution like the 1980s. In the 1980s, PCs took over computing, built very inexpensive platforms, very mass-produced. There are many players in the early PC days. In the 90s, the PC processing were integrated into HPC. And so, just so you remember, the early high-performance computing platforms got a lot of their advantage from leveraging the mass market technology. The mass market technology of 2020 is machine learning. These companies are playing in that mass market. HPC will have to leverage this for the high end as we move into the future. Okay, now let's check the time. So I have a large number of slides, which I don't think I will cover, so I'll give you some time to ask questions about how HPC and machine learning is used in neuroscience. And so this is the reverse way of looking at it, and this is really that high-performance computing always has been used for scientific applications, and neuroscience is also at this point in a big transition into data-rich science, and so consequently there will be a lot of HPC usage in neuroscience. So one of the fundamental challenges of brain simulations is linking structure to function across scales. By structure, meaning there is progress being made understanding how neurons connect to each other via synapses, and the structure is being painstakingly determined by experiments. There's in Europe a project, the European Brain Project, that started doing this in Lausanne or Switzerland. There is work done here in the US by Christoph Koch at the Allen Brain Institute in Seattle. They're all going from biological principles. They're trying to build a model of the brain. And this model of the brain, once we understand this, it's a question on how that will basically lead to understanding the functions. And that's a computational challenge. So I'll just skip over this because I want to get. There are a lot of projects here, both at UC Berkeley and at LBNL and UCSF. So you can look at these later. This is some Berkeley Lab project. These are some computing projects. Just want to point out, if that's of interest, there is a paper that is just appearing now by Chris Bouchard and many others in IEEE Computer this month that lists all this. The interesting thing is that you not only have the structural problem in terms of scaling up to the number of neurons, but you also have the timing problems, because behaviors are usually time dependent. So you have to keep many, many time slices, and you have to do this in a dynamic setting. Just another little anecdote. So if you want to see this in action, Chris Bouchard, if is willing, he sacrificed a rat for me, and he showed me how he implants some electrodes in the rat and then let the rat react to some stimulus and record brain recordings from the rat. That's basically the type of work that's happening. This is really in that connection that you try to understand in vivo activation level of neurons, so you see how neurons act when the rat sees a stimulus. The structural connectomics over here is also very interesting. So Christoph Koch, whom I mentioned, is actually really slicing, literally speaking, human brains, millimeter by millimeter slice, until he can build a complete human brain from anatomically correct principles, which is a huge data challenge because electron microscopy generates so many images, and he has to do basically segmentation and matching of these images, which are huge computational challenges. So all these interesting challenges are going on. As I said, this is just to give you a scale. The scaling challenge is always this. You can do it for worms or for fruit fly, but going to human gets you up into a very big space. And if you translate this, here we're almost back in the same picture again. This is the same question, very differently asked. This is if we do computational challenges about the human, what do we need? And we're somewhere between the exaflop and zetaflop, and we're between, in this case, between the exabyte and zettabyte, actually much more data intensive than what I had said earlier. But as I said, I would say refer to that paper in current issue of IEEE Computer. This is very intriguing, but I'll skip over it. I'll just say very briefly, so here's Steve Hawking again, and there's something which is also effectively called the Hawking machine. This is using brain recordings and understand how brain recordings correlate to speech, so you could actually do brain recordings and synthesize speech, and this is also some work that's done by Bouchard and others, and that involves a lot of machine learning algorithms and big data and high-performance computing. So I'll skip over this because I wanted to get to the, let's say, philosophical questions at the end, and I didn't want to keep you too long. So I hope, since you're still here, that's good. So I'd like to, hopefully you will react to this. So what I want to say is what computers still can't do. And so the last part of this six-fold activity was the question, is a brain a model for AI and machine learning? So what I'm really saying here is turn this question around and ask sort of the big question that motivated the talk. Will HPC plus AI together ever be able to outperform human intelligence? That is, will there be machines reaching superintelligence? So I can sort of ask you, what do you think? Who thinks HPC and AI will outperform human intelligence? Yes or no? Who thinks they will? Nobody, I should have asked that. Who thinks that machines will never reach superintelligence? Okay, a few people think, oh good, well, philosophically I agree with you. But I'll tell you why the answer is more differentiated. So I'll give you, of course, two answers, being an uncommitted politician maybe. Computers are already super intelligent today. People forget about this. Computers are super intelligent today, and I'll make this point very clearly very soon. That's one answer. The other answer is no, computers will not reach human levels of now replaced intelligence with consciousness, because we need to learn what consciousness actually really is. Now that's a different question, so I went sort of a little bit tricky on you, because I said yes to intelligence, no to consciousness. I'll make this a little bit more precise. So I do want to tell you yet another anecdote. So this is where I'm coming from. This is me in 1967 or thereabouts. And I have this wonderful toy that I received for my birthday, actually, which was a play computer, which was actually a very genius thing because it was not very expensive, but it basically could teach very much what a computer is. So what you see here is you have this plastic chassis, and you have here a dozen switches, and you had wires, and the wires were connected to a battery, and there were light bulbs in the back. And so the wiring diagram was basically you were hardwiring certain programs into this, and then you could have input by pushing a switch and output by having light bulbs. Yes?
Is that like an FPGA?
Oh, is that like an FPGA? That's more
like Raspberry Pi.
Well, I would say, well, maybe, but I never thought it was anything as close to an FPGA. You can figure out there, I had a dozen switches, a dozen input, well, there were a dozen input devices and a couple of light bulbs as output device. So you program it by wiring, so yeah, that's maybe FPGA, maybe right. So you just basically had a wiring diagram how you put the switches together. So you could do actually some very simple things with it. And so first of all, I got to say, this got me fascinated very early on, and I probably wouldn't be here if I hadn't played this many years ago, 60 years ago. But 50 years ago, not that old. But the interesting thing is what I've learned in there. And so there was this game, which was a tic-tac-toe-like game, which I programmed up. And then I figured out how that game worked, and I could figure out how I could win the game all the time, because it was just too simple a game. So once you figured that out. So I won the game. I tried, oh, this is how it works, this is how it works. So then after I figured that out, I won the game about 5-6 times in a row. And of course, it was only a minute or so to play this game to the end. After I had won it 5 or 6 times in a row, it occurred to me that I said, is the computer upset at me that I figured out how to win the game and beat him? Of course, I made him a guy, beat him all the time. And then I thought about this for maybe 15 seconds, and I said, no. I built this thing myself. It's just a plastic box with wires and light bulbs and batteries. There's nothing to it but wires and light bulbs and batteries. So I basically came to a conclusion there that a computer like this cannot have a mental state of being angry, upset, or happy, or anything like this. And I realized later that not believing that a computer can have a mental state is actually equivalent that I say I don't believe in strong AI. I'll come to this in a little bit later. So basically, I don't believe in strong AI. And ever since I don't believe in strong AI, and even though many years later I'm using computers now that have millions of cores and who knows, billions of wires, and maybe take 10 megawatts of power instead of a small 4.5 volt battery, and instead of output devices of light bulbs have some very fancy display screens, it is still basically wires and power supplies and switches. That's all there is. And so there is no mental state in a computer, very simply put. So this is where I'm coming from, and I'll say a little bit more about this in a moment, but let's come back to the question of intelligence. Why did I say that supercomputers are super intelligent today? Well, you have to say, what is intelligence? And I very much like this theory of multiple intelligence, Howard Gardner, who basically says intelligence is very multidimensional. There are many aspects of intelligence, and some of the aspects of intelligence are listed here. Now you can basically put them on sort of a Venn diagram. There's human capability. Actually, unfortunately, one that dropped out in my editing is there's a math logical reasoning that should sit here at this corner. So there's verbal linguistic, math logical reasoning, pattern recognition, bodily, that means can you do very well in ballet or in taekwondo, musical, interpersonal, that's social intelligence. So there are all these dimensions of intelligence. And so to be intelligent, you have to be balanced or should have capabilities in all of this. Now, the fact that all of us, you and me, are here means that we probably have a very strong mathological capability and also a very good verbal linguistic capability, because that's what's important today in SAT scores and getting into college and getting into graduate school. You have to be very good, especially in engineering or in computer science math field. You have to be really good in your logical thinking, your mathematical thinking, and you have to have a strong verbal linguistic capability. And so consequently, of course, then there's always the old joke, how about your social intelligence? And you can judge yourself where you're on this Venn diagram. But anyway, the important thing is, if you look at supercomputers, supercomputers are way out there. Supercomputers today in mathematical logical by an order of 1 million or more beat human capability. Write down 2 64-bit floating point numbers in binary and multiply them together and figure out how long that will take you, maybe a minute or two. And then you figure out that a supercomputer can do these in petaflops time, so in 10 to the 15 floating point operations per second. So supercomputer works probably 10 to the 15 times or maybe 10 to the 12 times faster than the human brain. So a supercomputer today is super intelligent. It's super intelligent in this one very limited but important dimension. So in that sense, my answer is already there. Superintelligence exists out there. Now, have supercomputers become evil? No, of course not. But that's sort of the differentiation you have to make in terms of superintelligence, supercomputer sphere. I would say machine learning is pretty much a pattern recognition capability. Machine learning has made significant progresses. It's basically now outside the human capability. What you can do in machine learning in terms of pattern recognition, we're doing much, much better today than human capability. It's another dimension of superintelligence where computers have reached already beyond the human capability. So that answers the yes part of my question. So on that topic, I want to make a comment about the Turing test. Turing test actually only tests one dimension, the verbal linguistic, because Turing test says you talk to a computer, and if you think it's a human, then the computer has passed the Turing test. It doesn't test anything about the humanity of the computing system. So there is something called the IKEA test, which you may have heard about it, which tests basically the dexterity. And this is basically, you have a wiring diagram and a robot, and the robot will have to wire that or build the chair or build the cupboard or whatever based on just looking at that wiring diagram. So it requires spatial thinking and it requires dexterity. Now, I don't want to take credit for this, but I want to say this here. I gave this lecture 2 years ago, an earlier version of this lecture in Singapore, and lo and behold, Nanyang Technology University in Singapore, maybe they heard me lecturing, saying they built a robot that can assemble an IKEA chair in about 20 minutes. So there's progress. That's good. That's really good. I'm glad. I'm happy to see this because basically it just proves a point that I'm going to make. And I think this chart that I shows the intelligence capabilities are very much narrow, put into boxes. And if we focus on a box, if we focus on a singing computer, we can build a singing computer. We can even build, if you focus really hard on a socially intelligent computer, you may remember that Microsoft did this, which was reading the user's emotion and gave you some warm feeling if you didn't feel good about Microsoft software. Didn't work really. There's very well-defined things that you can do. So basically, if you focus in it, even in 2 years, you can have big success. So on the yes part here, will AI and HPC outperform human intelligence that is reaching superintelligence? So yes, computers are already superintelligent today. Certainly in narrow defined categories of intelligence, computers are outperforming humans. As long as the tasks are well defined in some algorithmic framework, and Go is a very algorithmic framework, there will be continued success in achieving superintelligence. However, and this is sort of the interesting one, is the reason we don't see that progress in something like self-driving cars is because we don't have this well-defined, constrained algorithmic framework. There are these so-called edge conditions, and you probably followed all the discussion about self-driving cars that make it so much harder to build intelligence that do self-driving cars. Actually, since I have another minute, I'll give you my fundamental concern about self-driving cars is that we're doing it wrong. Because we make cars look at street signs, then use human intelligence to see that that street sign is a stop sign, then translate this into now you have to stop. That's sort of the wrong approach. We should have a little transmitter in the stop sign which has an established protocol which tells a car which has a receiver, this is a stop sign, stop. And each pedestrian going on the street and bicyclist has to have some transmitter on themselves on their helmet or so saying, I'm a pedestrian, I'm a bicyclist, I'm just a garbage bag. Send this out. I mean, it's doable. You just have to define the standards and the chip processors are cheap. Then it's much easier because what we're trying to do is making cars behave like human drivers. That's not a good way of going about it. Anyway, just a thought in case you're interested in self-driving cars. Maybe there's some idea, some big idea in there. So, John McCarthy, who invented and coined the term, professor at Stanford, artificial intelligence, made this very famous quote, and he said, as soon as it works, nobody calls it AI anymore. And so supercomputers have been working for 60 years doing floating-point calculations, are very good in mathematical calculations, so nobody calls this AI anymore. It's It's just a fact of life that supercomputers are so fast and they do calculation. Nobody thinks that this is strange or dangerous. And I think that one other thing is pattern recognition, the way it is handled by current machine learning techniques and AI, will reach a certain sense of normalcy in 5 to 10 years, but nobody will think of this as anything sort of special anymore. But I do want to go back to my philosophical question. So I always love this simulation. You've seen this climate simulation before from a group of folks up at the lab. Michael Weiner is, I think, the key author on this. So again, you see a simulation of global climate, and you see in particular precipitation over the globe. And I just gotta figure my mouse on the right spot. Well, that wasn't the right spot to get the video rolling. Oh, here's my mouse. Okay. So while this is spinning up, I always find this is very beautiful to watch, and you can look at this both in awe and admiration of seeing. So this is water vapor in the atmosphere integrated vertically. So these are columns of water, and you look at this and you see these vertices spinning out, and these are all tropical storms or hurricanes, and you see typical patterns evolving, like the hurricane spinning around the Caribbean, then hitting the continental United States. So the key question I want to ask you is, does Corey know what a hurricane is? Probably not. You know what a hurricane is. Even though you've never seen one, you know what a hurricane is. So you have contextual information. You can think about this, and at the same moment you see this, you connect this to basically the experience citizens in Puerto Rico and in Texas had this summer with hurricanes hitting there. Or you think about typhoons in the Asia-Pacific region. So the thing is, what we have in machine intelligence is we have a very narrow defined pattern recognition which can look at this data set and determine that under certain conditions, when you have certain vortices which have certain pressure and moisture conditions and behave in a certain way, then this will be a hurricane, or will be defined to be a hurricane. So the moment you can mathematically, algorithmically prescribe a phenomena, it's very easy for a computer to find it. But if you try to tell a computer what is a hurricane in all its ramifications, what it means for people, what you see, what will happen to ships, what will happen to roads, what flooding might occur, this is something which is imprecise and therefore is not very easy to communicate. So a computer does not know, Corey does not know, even though Corey did these beautiful simulations, does not know what a hurricane is. So here we come to the strong and weak AI. A strong AI is a physical system that can have a mind and a mental state. So a mind and a mental state is, does my computer get upset when I win? No, it doesn't get upset. It's just a box with wires and light bulbs or screens. Does the Corey computer at NERSC know what a hurricane is? No, it doesn't, because it just has a symbolic representation of some weather phenomenon. So I fundamentally, and I said this from the very beginning, and this is an experiential statement, I do not believe that strong AI is possible, that computers can actually develop a mental state, and on the basis of that mental state, computers can interact with us as intelligent beings. I just don't think that's possible. Now, this is a very deep philosophical question. There's a lot of debate, but I'm just telling you what I think, and I gave you a couple of reasons why I don't think it's true. Now, weak AI is a physical symbol system can act intelligent. So this is basically, is it possible to develop a computer system that acts like a human brain? So it's still a computer system. I deny it an intelligent state, but it will interact with you like a human. This is basically what the Turing test is. You write a computer system that interacts with you, that can speak with you, can have a dialogue with you, and you cannot distinguish it from a non-human. And that's actually a much more likely and much more challenging, but it's very challenging to do. So I think this is a principle. It's possible to do this, to build a computer system that if you interact with that system, is indistinguishable from a human. So it's just like the fundamental sort of question that is, I'll pick you, Sylvia, I hope you don't mind. I look at Sylvia and I look at her and I say, she's not a robot. But how do I know this? You act intelligent, you have sort of a good conversation, you can drink your coffee, you have all the human attributes. So I make the inference that you're not a robot. But that's actually very, very difficult. We can build a system, but then I don't know how we can distinguish if that system. So the system can get upset, it can fail qualifying exam, can do all the things that humans do.
Well, you can do the Blade Runner test.
What's Blade Runner? I come to Blade Runner in a minute, but what's the Blade Runner test?
No, there was a test that he was running to figure out whether the person was a replicant or not.
Oh, and what was the test? Gee, I should know this because I actually quote Blade.
It's a made-up name. Anyway.
It's a made-up. Okay. So basically, what I think is, and so this is why the last section of this is what computers still can't do, is that machines will think, they will have intelligent capabilities that outperform humans, but they will have nothing to do with humans. That will be a different level of intelligence, will be very, very different from humans. So therefore, we will not be able really to confer on future machines sort of the same individuality or whatever, it's a personality that we see in humans. So as I said before with Deep Blue, the computer model is not very helpful in explaining what people actually do when they think. Computers will think, they will think and solve problems and will do it very differently from humans. And we don't know, and so a super intelligent computer will be intelligent in the setting that I described, but we don't know how they act and what they will do, if they act and do anything at all. So, I have 2 more slides, or 3 more slides. What is really going to be the real challenge as we go in? I'll go over this one. I'm just going to say, I'm not afraid of intelligent computers taking over the world and killing all humans. I'm not afraid about this at all. I think I give you enough reasons why I don't think I'm concerned about it. There are a couple of things I am concerned about. One is that computers will control increasingly complex systems that will interact as systems with each other, and therefore we have no more understanding how those systems really came to the decisions that the systems made. So a good example is this high-frequency trading. There was the so-called flash crash in 2011 that led to a complete random, so it seemed, fluctuation of the market. Big drop in the Dow Jones by almost 10% over a period of 20 minutes. In those 20 minutes, Apple was sold at 100,000, and some computer programs bought Apple shares for $100,000. GE was sold at 10 cents, and some computer programs sold GE at 10 cents. And that was all based on some algorithmic assumptions. A lot of money was changing hands. In the end, they stopped trading, and there was an analysis of that flash crash later, but the analysis does not tell us anything what really happened. So I'm concerned that as we have more and more autonomous computer systems making decisions, interacting with each other, we create a system of systems that may lead to surprising results that we cannot predict and leave us at mercy. So just think about whatever. Financial market crash is sort of a good example, but there are others you could construct. The other one is, what I'm concerned about is that this rapid development in machine learning, deployment of machine learning devices everywhere, having large-scale IoT devices, huge amounts of data will be collected everywhere, stored in the cloud. Real-time streaming is available, and then we do behavioral prediction. And so here's my Blade Runner and my, thank you. Here's my Blade Runner and my Minority Report. So as I probably argued, even though I have to look up the Blade Runner test for how to distinguish the replicants from real things.
It's called void comp test. You probably can pronounce this way better than I can. It looks at the emotional response. You basically tell the replicant something that would irritate a human.
I see.
Something like that.
Good. Well, but if you're a perfect replicant, then you can be irritated. Anyway, I don't believe this one is the future because I don't think this is likely, as I said. But what I'm concerned is that this is more likely to be a future. And what I mean by a minority report, if you know the story, is that people are assessed about the likelihood of committing crimes, and you get preemptively be arrested, even if you haven't done anything yet, because there is a predictive. So this is basically the future is you go into 7-Eleven, and there is a streaming camera which takes a photo of you, and for some reason you are in some database as a wanted criminal, then instantly the 7-Eleven robots come and arrest you and put, they can do this. 7-Eleven robots can put handcuffs on you and put you away until the real police come in. But that's kind of what I'm really afraid of, that there is behavioral prediction that will, and we have behavioral prediction already now. So we have behavioral prediction. You have something like a credit score, which is a behavioral prediction. Takes your past behavior and predicts what you will do in the future. Imagine how you can amplify this in many other ways. You know that China has the citizen score, which is sort of the next level up. If you're really concerned about these things, watch some episode in Black Mirror that I find very fascinating. I mean, you all have your Uber score, and Uber drivers have your score, so we're doing this already. And so what I'm concerned about is that there will be this huge data repository in your cloud where all your scores are stored, and everything you do will be watched and added to the score, and then machine learning algorithm make some predictions. So, we shouldn't let him drive his car today. He's bound to go in an accident, which would be good, but as I said, you could also get arrested for 7-Eleven. Well, this is just, I'll skip over. This is a nice another video. So here are my key messages. I'm just very quickly scan through because Aiden wants me to finish up. Supercomputing, active and thriving. HPC technology is a factor of 1 million away from the human brain. We need technology architectural innovation to change the gap. Neuromorphic computing is the one direction to go. What I know today is I think an artificial sentient superintelligence is unlikely strong AI and a real identity in there. Weak AI, I think, has great potential. I think the real danger is to turn things over to systems that we don't understand and don't control, and that are driven by huge computers that work in the background. All right, thank you. Thanks for staying so long. I'll take questions.
In light of what you're saying about the end of Moore's Law and kind of AI and ML disrupting HPC, for those of us, I guess I want your advice, for those of us who are just starting out in our PhDs and are going to have another 30, 40 years of a career, and we're doing very traditional scientific computing, HPC, essentially computational physics that relies on a really fine discretization and throwing a whole bunch of cores at something in order to make any progress. Should we be worried? Should we be jumping on the ML hype train, or,
no.
you know?
This is another constant in all computing is that things that existed never haven't gone away. So there continues to be a strong need in doing this. It may be different. I would say an interesting question would be how you would use some of these architectures that will come out in the next couple of years for doing physical simulation. I think that there's also a lot of questions. So, well, physical simulation will be really important if you believe in virtual environments. So my current favorite movie is Ready Player One. I just watched it and I was just absolutely thrilled by this, and that all requires a huge amount of physical simulation. So the need for physical simulation will not go away, and I think the interesting topic of the next couple of years will be to explore different platforms for doing physical simulation now. And also finding algorithms that you can actually do a physical simulation on a portable device or so.
Okay, Ben.
I have a question about NVIDIA chips and the price doubling.
Yeah.
How much of an impact does that actually make with the total cost of operation, since power is such a huge part of the cost?
That's a very good question. So there always the distinction between operation and acquisition, and it makes, of course, a dramatic difference in the acquisition. It will help Long term, of course, a lot in the operation. So you could make an argument that the more energy efficiency that you get with a game processor will sort of offset the initial acquisition cost. That's, I think, a very valid economic analysis you can do. In a practical setting, unfortunately, what's happening is that in a big institution's budget, like in, let's say, at LBNL, the operating costs and the acquisition costs are sort of different budget items. And so it's very difficult to argue I'll save on the acquisition cost. I'll pay more on the acquisition cost than I save on the operating cost. It may be different in an industrial setting, but I think generally these are always capital expenditures, operating expenditures, and CapEx and OpEx are kept in separate buckets by all accountants.
Let's do one last question.
Oh, this is the last?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So you talk about neuromorphic computing.
Yes.
And I wonder what, for this audience, what you think about quantum computing.
Oh, quantum computing.
That's Thursday.
Yeah, we ask Jonathan on Thursday. Actually, you should ask Jonathan. Jonathan has done a very nice 3 or 4 page white paper, which says hype and myth of quantum computing, and he should. Hopefully, he'll talk about this. I think that at one level, I think quantum computing is a very positive development, but quantum computing is not replace any of the stuff we are doing here. It's solving different sets of problems. I mean, there's some overlap. You can solve some physical simulation problems from quantum computer, but I think doing AI and machine learning on quantum computers is sort of a harebrained idea, because quantum computers currently are extremely limited in I/O capability, and how do you do ever big data sets on a system where you don't have any I/O capability? I mean, this is a challenge for a decade from now. So I think quantum computing will be extremely useful in a subset of things and will develop in that, but it will not replace general purpose computing. It will not be a force in machine learning and AI. I can tell you, well, that's another fun story. I'd love to tell this story for all of you who are into quantum physics. So I had a workshop. Actually, Irfan Siddiqui was organized about 1.5 years ago, and then we had this end of the workshop meeting where we said, what do we actually believe will happen about quantum computing? So I had 5 questions to the audience. I asked everybody to write down the answer to 5 questions. We're all like, when will we reach quantum supremacy? And so on, some very serious question. 5th question was, it is the year 2040. You have your quantum computer at home. What do you think is the killer application on your quantum computer at home? And well, sort of the obvious one, I'll do Bitcoin mining or whatever. And yeah, of course, or whatever. But the one, I would say, the real killer app, in a double sense, you'll like it, is I will watch Schrödinger cat videos. So for those of you who know about Schrödinger cat, of course, will get that. So I thought that was really cute. It's a killer app, by the way. Half of the cases for cat is not alive. Okay.
I think this is enough because...
enough.
Thank you very much, Horst, again.
Please come on Thursday for Jonathan's talk.
Yeah. As Horst already said, the last lecture will be given by Jonathan Carter on Thursday about quantum computing.